What is art about? What's it good for? What are museums good for? The museums that I'm coming to like the most are small museums. I think that's maybe where the future of museums right now is, where they don't have to pay such close attention to getting huge numbers of people in, and where the noise level is lower, places where you may actually find yourself in a room alone with a painting. That's the way the modern used to be. You had a fighting chance of actually being able to stand alone in front of a Cézanne. Your whole life can change. I was a teacher, a college English teacher. Teaching was great. I enjoyed it a lot because I believed in its importance, and I liked the kids. You try to find them and you try to help them, and then you just hope that life doesn't tear them to pieces. You hope they don't go to Vietnam. There are a lot of things about education that are just painful. It can't all be fun and games. I'd look out my office window and the parking lot would be full of Porsches, and I realized, these kids have more money to fool around with than I do to live. And it was a corrosive discovery. The whole old conception of what the Academy was, how it was to operate, began to come apart. The obligation to be entertaining began to be paramount. So I found the job to be increasingly hard, and on top of it, I had found this thing that I absolutely loved to do. A friend of mine came back from Korea. He'd been a soldier, and he had a 35mm Japanese camera, and he said, Bob, this is fun, you ought to try it. So I picked up the camera, and indeed it was fun, and within about 6 months I had my own 35mm and went out and took a few pictures in Rocky Mountain National Park. And one of them, by almost complete accident, turned out to be a picture. It was just a picture of a stream, of little rapids. But as I say, it was a gift. Like almost all projects begin with a gift. We lived right next to the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center, and it had a terrific art library. Again, by accident, I discovered a complete run of Alfred Stieglitz's camera work in the original. And so I just went through it like a madman. He said, all true things are equal. He said, I want to die living. In the early 70s, it seemed to me that it was so unfashionable to ask sort of basic questions about how does art relate to life? Is it worth a life to do it? Is it worth the suffering that it's obviously going to entail? I mean, you're going to get a lot of abuse if you stand up and say, hey, I got a picture you haven't seen. You're going to take it in the chops often for that. So is it worth doing? I've been so lonely trying to become a photographer myself. I have to admit that if I'd known how long the odds were, I don't know how in the world, I don't think I'd ever have the courage to do it again. You get to the point where you just feel like you have something that is your own, and that if you don't find an audience for it, you're going to burst. Of course, no publisher wants to touch just pictures. You've got to have words. There's something very primal. Most people are terrified in front of visual things. They want talk. Say something. Just say anything to let the air out. What you learn is you can't talk about your own. If you could talk about it, that's what you do. Robert Frost, somebody came up to him and said, tell me what you said in this poem. He said, you want me to say it worse? Hopper, for example, was known to spend days to come up with a tiny paragraph because it had such a potential for screwing things up. Every once in a while, somebody will help. And that's what John Cherkovsky did. He wrote the introduction to the New West. I'm so grateful, even now, all these years later, that he did it. I sometimes go, I'm sorry to say, months without taking a picture. There are times, however, when you just shoot like a crazy fool, and those are wonderful. Darkroom work is okay, and there are some thrills involved when you see a picture that's a good one coming up in the soup. But what you do it for is being outside and discovering the picture in the finder. The discouraging part is that if you look at the overall percentages, the percentage of the time that you're out taking the picture is maybe 1 or 2%. And the rest of it is all the other stuff. Turning back was something new for me. The occasion for the book was the Bicentennial of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was much ballyhooed here to the point where I couldn't stand it anymore. It was a big commercial thing. You know, they were sort of an early extension of the imperial ambition of the United States. These guys were sort of early special ops. They had certain scientific pretensions, but mostly it was economic, and their attitude toward native people was horrible. I think it's interesting that the trip back was rougher than the trip going out. They're very gripping occasionally as they describe the scenes that they saw coming out, the scenes of wildlife, for example, and the forests that they saw. Can you imagine having seen that and then go back to the squalor of the American frontier? Quite often, as we were working, I kept remembering the photographs of George Bernard, the photographer in the Civil War, whose photographs often show woods blown apart by cannon fire. And it seemed quite close to what we were looking at. Trees snapped off, strange shapes, almost like the shapes in O'Sullivan's pictures of corpses. I'm sure there is some kind of extremely long-range way to affirm even this, but it's beyond me. As a limited human being, I can't find it. It was almost like a kind of combat photography. What I was looking at was so horrible and so broken. In general, what a photographer is after, a still photographer, pictures in which nothing is isolate, nothing is unrelated. I couldn't find something to affirm in many of these scenes. There wasn't a wholeness that I could find. It left me with a question. All right, am I doing just journalism? Am I doing just a report on unmitigated disaster? Have I given up the notion of art as somehow finally an affirmation? And the only way, in this case, that I was able to I hope, perhaps partially answer that question was to see the book itself, the whole business, as an affirmation, finally. The subject of the book, in a way, is deforestation. The theme of the book really is the glory of the natural world and the tragic nature of human beings. The West is gone. What did we do with it? When we moved out here, we asked ourselves, what's the most important subject here? It's the hills everywhere. They've been butchered. When you walk clear cuts, you find yourself asking all kinds of questions. But the central one is, what have we traded for this great forest? What did we get in exchange? You could ask the same of a great deal that's going on in America right now. What are we celebrating? And that's the question of the book. Clearly, we can't go any farther west. Can we go east and make the country we talked about? So I decided we'd just go east until I could find something to affirm. And not unimportantly, I guess, we went to the edge of the desert. I think that all art is after a stillness. There is a stillness. there. And there's a stillness here too, if you look for it enough. I mean, maybe even on a cut-over ridgetop, if you're good enough, you could find a stillness. But I'm not good enough at the moment. When I quit teaching, I found I still cared a lot about kids. That's one of the things that I find so sad, frankly, when I think about what young people in the arts face now. It just happened when I started as a photographer. You could hope to get enough from the National Endowment for the Arts to almost live a year. Oregon has survived by two industries, fundamentally, both extractive, timber and fishing, and both collapsed almost simultaneously. And with it, many social changes have occurred, most of them sad. The timber industry here is very, very clever. And they have succeeded in embedding in the tax laws of the state the funding of schools from the short-term profits of commercial timber. So if you come and argue that we should take a longer view, their response is, you're undermining the education of children. So it's fiendish. I mean, the whole system is contrived to perpetuate this until the last tree falls and nothing grows. Getting up in the morning is really hard sometimes, you know. Just to get up and brush your teeth and put on your shoes and walk down the street to your job, all of it's hard. It seems to me that art, that journalism, that history, that all these things are, if seriously pursued, are really designed to promote courage. You're trying to keep the messages coming in that life is so precious. Yeah, it's also uncomfortable, but I'm still willing to do it. So it's been a good life. I have no hesitation in saying that if you can find the key to getting on this track, which is a lot of luck and a certain amount of doggedness and some gifts, if you can do it, it's a good trip.